is used in this article in its broadest signification, as applied to the entire Western world, that is, North and South America and all the adjacent islands. The discovery of America by Columbus and the earliest expeditions and attempts at settlement in various parts of the continent and in many of the contiguous islands are intimately connected with the Jews and their history. Columbus received great assistance from astronomical works prepared by Jews and from scientific instruments of which Jews were the inventors. Luis de Santigel and Gabriel Sanchez, both Moranos, and Juan Cabrero, of Jewish descent, urged upon Queen Isabella the importance of the plans of Columbus and were instrumental in securing the funds for the first and second voyages. The expenses of the latter were defrayed almost exclusively out of the monies derived from the confiscated properties of Jews. At least 5 persons of Jewish blood accompanied Columbus upon his first voyage, among whom special mention must be made of Luis de Torres, who was to have acted in the capacity of interpreter. Torres is said to have been the first European to tread the soil of America and the first to discover the use of tobacco. He settled and died in Cuba. On March 31st, 1492, the Catholic monarchs issued a decree to the effect that within 4 months all Jews and Jewesses were to leave the kingdom and lands of Spain. On April 3rd, the decree was publicly announced by the heralds, and on the same day, Columbus was ordered to equip a fleet for his voyage to the Indies. On August 2nd, 1492, about 300,000 Jews left Spain to settle wherever they might find a shelter. And on the following day, the fleet of Columbus set sail. His journals open with a reference to the coincidence in time of these 2 events. Columbus' first account of his discovery took the form of a letter to his Jewish patron, Santigel. The facts mentioned suffice to explain the very early presence of Jews in America. See Kersling, Christopher Columbus, and the participation of Jews in the Spanish and Portuguese discoveries. Brazil. Fun fact: if you watch if you watch Sam Hyde, you'll notice that every time anyone on his show makes mention of Jews, they substitute it with the word Brazilian. Ain't that something? Brazilian. Brazil was discovered in 1499 by a Spaniard, Pinzon, and independently in 1500 by a Portuguese, Pedro Alvarez de Cabral. With him was a Jewish mariner, Gaspar, who was of, pardon me as I readjust, who was of much assistance in the discovery of Brazil and who is favorably mentioned by Amerigo Vespucci. Brazil was the part of America earliest inhabited by large numbers of Jews. Portugal sent annually 2 shiploads of Jews and criminals. And also Jews and criminals. And also deported persons who had been condemned by the Inquisition. The Moranos are said to have quickly thrown off their mask and to have professed Judaism. As early as 1548, according to some, 1531, Portuguese Jews, it is asserted, transplanted the sugarcane from Madeira to Brazil. But whether this be true or false, it is indisputable that nearly all the large sugar plantations of Brazil during the first half of the 17th century belonged to Jews. So extensive had the immigration to Portuguese colonies become in 1557 that on June 30th of that year, an edict was issued forbidding Moranos to leave Portugal. Wow. A stringent law was passed prohibiting the settlement of Jews in the Spanish colonies as well, yet some of position and wealth were among the early settlers. This is indicated by the fact that the prohibition was removed in 1577 upon the payment by the Jews in the colonies of the enormous sum of 1,700,000 cruzados, equivalent to about $714,000. And this was written in, or published rather, in 1912. In 16, I need to go back. I want to read that again. This is indicated by the fact that the prohibition was removed in 1577 upon the payment by the Jews in the colonies of the enormous sum of 1,700,000 cruzados. Okay, so just to clarify, it was the prohibition. It was the prohibition of Jews to leave Portugal. They weren't allowed to leave. And they said, oh, what if we give you a whole bunch of money? And they came up with a whole bunch of money, and now they're allowed to leave. Okay, let's see. Where are we? In 1611, mention is made of wealthy Marranos making the return trip from Bahia to Portugal. The Jews had settled in Brazil prior to the Dutch occupation in sufficient numbers to make them a military factor. Is shown by the argument advanced in favor of an attack by the Dutch West India Company on the Portuguese in Brazil, that the Jews there would be ready to aid the Dutch in any attempt. This attack was successfully made in 1624, at which time the Jews in the country unified in the formation of a congregation. Jews had invested largely in the Dutch West India Company, and to this fact the favorable attitude of the Holland authorities is traceable. Those who had come over under Portuguese and Dutch rule were reinforced in 1642 by a party of 600 from Amsterdam, bringing with them Hakam Isaac Aboab, who settled at Recife, Pernambuco, and was probably the first rabbi in Brazil. Among these settlers was also Ephraim Suerdo, a stepbrother of Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh himself intended to immigrate to Brazil, as is learned from a letter of Vossius to Grotius, but he was dissuaded by the leading men of his community. There were also settlements at Paraíba, Bahia, and Rio de Janeiro. It is estimated that at Recife alone there were more than 5,000 Jews in 1654. If any of you can pronounce things correctly that I am failing to, let us know in the comments. Thank you. The Brazilian Jews enjoyed the same rights as other Dutch subjects, and they rendered valuable services both as soldiers and in civil life. The first Spanish and Portuguese settlers in America, other than banished criminals, were adventurers seeking land for the crown or gold for themselves. This was not true of the Jews. Expelled first from Spain, next from Portugal, they desired only a place in which they might have the opportunity to live in... Hey, Ed. Threw me off. Okay. Focus, Julian. Expelled first from Spain, next from Portugal, they desired only a place in which they might have the opportunity to live and to throw off the mask of Christianity which they had been forced to wear. Though they engaged largely in commerce, in which they had especial advantages, having correspondence in Venice, in Turkey, and in other countries to which their co-religionists had immigrated, they counted among their number several scholars, and during the Dutch occupation maintained friendly relations with learned men in Amsterdam. The first trace of Jewish literature in Amsterdam is found in 1636 when some Brazilian Jews, in dispute about liturgical questions, sought counsel of Haim Shabbatai of Salonika. In the middle of the 17th century, there were living in Brazil, in addition to Rabbi Isaac Aboab, mentioned above, a well known Talmudist, Jacob Lagarto, and the poet Eliyahu Makoro. Apparently, the first Jewish scholar born on American soil was Jacob de Velocino, born in Pernambuco in 1657, a philosopher, physician, and polemical writer of ability. In 1646, war broke out between the Dutch and the Portuguese. Oh goodness, well, here I should have clipped my nails, shouldn't I have? Howdy, y'all. Thanks for joining me. This is going to be downloaded and mirrored at Folk Doom 3. In 1646, war broke out between the Dutch and the Portuguese. Oh my. And in this struggle, which lasted 9 years, the Jews aided the Dutch until the end. The Dutch capitulation in 1654 contained a rather ominous clause wherein the Portuguese promised to the Jews an amnesty and all wherein they could promise it. The suffering, can I get closer? Will it let me? Okay. All right, I'm working with this camera. The Dutch capitulation. Okay, I already read that. The suffering of the Jews in this war are related in a poem by Isaac Aboab, which is probably the earliest product extant of Jewish authorship on American soil. Although it does not appear that the Inquisition was formally established in Brazil, there is evidence to the effect that the Holy Office seized suspected persons and sent them to Portugal for trial. At all events, the Portuguese conquest was followed by the dispersion of the Jewish colony. Many returned to Amsterdam, some went to the French settlements, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Cayenne, some to Curacao, and others to New Amsterdam. We have travelers' statements to the effect that as late as 1850, a few remained in Brazil and as Maranos, and in very recent times, small congregations have been formed. Mexico, which contained the most highly civilized aborigines on the American continent, was invaded by Cortez in 1519. The capital was captured in 1521, and the country made a Spanish colony under the name Nueva España. The most authentic information concerning the Jews of Mexico is unhappily contained in the records of the Inquisition, from which accurate, if not detailed, accounts are derived. The first auto de fe celebrated in New Spain was held in the year 1536, and the first Jew, or rather Judaizer, as he was called, mentioned in these records is a certain Francisco Milan, who was reconciled in the year 1539. His case seems, however, to have been a solitary one, since for many years after the Inquisition were Lutherans or persons otherwise suspected of heresy. In 1571, the Inquisition was formally established in Mexico. Oh, wow. In 1571, the Inquisition was formally established in Mexico for the purpose of freeing the land, which had been contaminated by Jews and heretics, especially of the Portuguese nation. It is not until 1578 that the names of Jews, 3 in that year, are again met with, and from that time on until the close of 1920, A large proportion, possibly as many as one half of those tried, were Jews. Since all of these were Marranos and a great number of the secret Jews must have escaped the eye of the Inquisition, a fair conception may thus be obtained of the very considerable number who settled and lived in Mexico during this period. Paramus, the historian, writing in 1599, states that in spite of all obstacles, the Jews publicly celebrated their Passover. But the statement is open to question. Some ideas of the number of Jews in Mexico in the middle of the 17th century may be gained from the fact that in a single trial by the Inquisition, that of a boy in 1642, the names of no less than 86 Judaizers are mentioned. It is generally assumed that one of the principal motives of the Inquisition was the confiscation of estates, and it is unquestionably true that a considerable proportion of the Jews tried in Mexico were mine owners or merchants. Nevertheless, there must have been many Mexican Jews in the humbler walks of life. Between 1600 and 1650, the following occupations of Jews and Jewesses are recorded: butcher, gilder, baker, sugar hawker, peanut vendor, silversmith, juggler, nursery maid, and seamstress. In recent times, focus. Well, let me see what happens if I wipe my camera. All right. In recent times, Jews have again immigrated to Mexico, and recent times means about 1912 was published. And for a short time, a Jewish journal was published in the capital city. From 1590 until the revolt of Mexico from Spanish rule, the Philippine Islands were governed through the Viceroy and Audiencia of Mexico. And prior to 1601, at least 4 Jews had gone from Mexico to the city of Manila. Other South American states. Peru was captured by the Spanish in 1533 to 1534, and many Spanish Jews took refuge in Lima. Philip II took rigorous measures against them and early introduced the Inquisition. From imperfect records, it appears that a Jew was burnt there in 1581. In 1639, 12 Portuguese merchants, Jews, burnt, one of them inscribed as the Judaizing millionaire Manuel Batista Perez. 6,000 Portuguese, of whom it may be assumed many were Jews, purchased the right of residence upon the payment of 200,000 ducats. It appears to be the opinion of writers upon the Inquisition that in Lima the Holy Office was particularly rapacious, and that all rich Portuguese were charged with being Judaizers. Yet it is extremely likely that this cynical view is incorrect, and that the larger number of Portuguese in Peru in early days were actually Marranos. A few details of the history of the Jews in Peru are known. Though a memoir composed from original manuscript sources by B. Vicuna McKenna of a certain Francisco Moyen who suffered most grievously from the Inquisition in the 18th century. In very recent times, Jews, to the number of about 500, have settled in Peru. Jews are also to be found in very small numbers in Venezuela, Costa Rica, and other South American states. To the Argentine Republic, however, there has been a systematic immigration due directly to the efforts of Baron de Hirsch. It is estimated that there are now settled in that country about 6,755 Jews. C. Agriculture. As early as 1644, Jews commenced to go in small numbers to Paramaribo. In 1662, Lord Willoughby secured from Charles II permission to colonize Suriname. And 2 years later, the Jewish colony of Cayenne, which had been disbanded, removed to Suriname. In February 1667, Suriname, then an English colony, surrendered to a Dutch fleet. The Articles of Surrender provided that English subjects disposed to leave the colony should be at liberty to do so. 6 months later, Suriname was retaken by the English fleet and became again an English colony. But the Treaty of Breda, July 16th, 1667, it was restored to the Dutch. The circumstance became important because the British government made strong representations to Holland on behalf of Jewish residents of Suriname who, under this clause of the treaty, desired to leave for Jamaica, but to whom the Dutch authorities at Suriname refused permission to depart. That's curious. On account of their wealth and standing. In spite of the alien statues of Jews domiciled in English possessions from the point of view of British law, the Council of Great Britain found it expedient to recognize Jews as British subjects at this early date. The Dutch continued to the Jews the privileges which had been accorded them by the English. A synagogue was built at Savannah, which is said to have been exclusively by Jews. Another and larger synagogue was erected in Paramaribo. That's a fun word. Hold on, let me adjust. Many of the colonists, probably the major part of them, left with the English fleet under Captain Willoughby and settled in Jamaica and Barbados. In 1669, the Dutch government gave the Jews of Suriname a formal promise that they'd be allowed the free exercise of their religion. They were largely engaged in agriculture and were the first cultivators of the sugarcane in Suriname. When, in 1689, a French fleet made a sudden attack upon Suriname, it was met with brave resistance by the Jews under Samuel Nazi. And on a second attack in 1712, the Jews, under Captain Isaac Pinto, made a stubborn fight. They were also foremost in the suppression of the Negro revolts from 1690 to 1772. The first rabbi in Suriname was Isaac Neto. The date of his immigration to the colony must have been about 1674. In 1685, the congregation Baraka, We Shalom of Savannah, built a splendid synagogue. Pardon my unsteady hand. Because I'm live streaming, I can't zoom in. And that's unfortunate. Gotta steady my hands. In 1685, the congregation Baraka We Shalom of Savannah built a splendid synagogue. This was probably rendered possible by the considerable additions to the colony from Brazil after the reconquest of the country by the Portuguese. In 1890, the Jews in Suriname numbered about 1560, having two synagogues. One followed the Spanish and the other the German Rite. Cayenne. A colony was established here probably as early as 1650, and this was augmented by a party of 152 which set sail for Cayenne in August 1660. Among them was the Spanish Jewish poet, historian, and litterateur Miguel or Daniel de Barrios. In 1664, the colony at Cayenne was dissolved, the inhabitants moving to Suriname, as stated above, to Jamaica, and to Barbados. Curacao? In 1650, 12 Jewish families were brought to Curacao. In 1652, 2 leagues of land along the coast for 50 families, and 4 leagues for 100 families were granted by the Dutch West India Company to Joseph Nunes de Fonseca, alias David Nazi, and others to found a colony of Jews in that island. As early as 1654, direct relations between the settlers and the inhabitants of New Netherlands were established. And that year, immigrants of wealth and standing arrived in considerable numbers from Brazil. The first burial ground was established in 1656, and by 1692, the congregation Mekev Israel had completed its synagogue. A second congregation, Neva Shalom, was established in 1740, and in 1865, a Reformed congregation under the name Emmanuel. In 1690, a party of about 90 set sail for North America and established themselves in Rhode Island, that is, in Newport, the West Indies. In 1502, King Ferdinand prohibited such as might already be settled there. As noted above, Louis de Torres, who accompanied Columbus on his first voyage, settled and died in Cuba. It is asserted that as early as 1493, young Jewish children were, after baptism, sent to the island of St. Thomas. In 1642, mention is made of a certain Miguel Nunez, a Marrano in Cuba, and some authorities incline to the opinion that the first considerable settlement of Jews in New Amsterdam came from that island. Barbados. Jews settled in Barbados as early as 1628, but the first definite information relates to the year 1661, when certain traders petitioned the king to permit them to live and trade in Barbados and Suriname. As early as 1664, reference is made to a Jew named Signor Abraham Israel de Pisa, who found gold in the island. Another person of nearly the same name, Isaac Israel de Piso, fell under the king's displeasure in March 1665, owing to his failure to find the expected gold mines. In 1668, Jews are mentioned as owners of sugar works. In 1671, Moses Pereira was made a free denizen. And in 1673, the Jews began an agitation for recognition of their rights as citizens. Classic. On February 18th, 1674, a law was passed granting them the privilege of taking the oath upon 5 books of Moses. And in January 1675, a favorable response was made by the Assembly to their petition for the extension of their trade privileges. In 1676, Governor Sir Jonathan Atkins reported that there were about 30 Jewish families of Dutch extraction from Brazil. On October 29th, 1679, Jacob Sr. arrived at Barbados. In the year 1680, according to a contemporary document, there were 54 adult Jews and 182 children residing in and about the town of St. Michael's. These Jews owned a large number of slaves. In 1679, a few of the Barbados Jews immigrated, 3 to London, 2 to Jamaica, and 1 to Suriname. According to the census of 1891, there were 21 Jewish families on the island. Jamaica. Jews probably settled here in considerable numbers in the second half of the 16th century. The first Jews, 6 in number, who were introduced into Jamaica under British government in 1663, came on the ship Great Guest. Captain Bernard. Okay, now I've confused myself. Came on the ship Great Guest, Captain Bernard. In December 1671, Governor Lynch reported to Lord Arlington that the king could have no more profitable subjects than Jews. Meanwhile, petitions of merchants against them were considered by the king's council, the request being that the Jews be restricted to wholesale trade, which proposition the council rejected. In 1700, the Jews presented to Sir William Beeston, Governor-in-Chief of Jamaica, a petition asking for exemption from special taxes and reciting other grievances. The trade between London and Jamaica was principally in Jewish hands, and by 1750 and 200, Jews resided and had been naturalized in that island. One of the best-known literary men of Jamaica was Daniel Israel Lopez, who translated the Psalms into Spanish. At the present day, there is a flourishing Jewish community in Jamaica. Who'd have thunk it? Leeward Islands. On August 31st, 1694, an act was passed to prevent Jews from engrossing commodities imported into the Leeward Islands, which act was repealed in 1701, an indication that there must have been an early settlement of considerable proportions there. Of Puerto Rico, nothing is known concerning any Jewish settlement, any early Jewish settlement, that is. In recent years, since the Spanish-American War, Jews have immigrated thither, and there is now a flourishing congregation. The resettlement in England and its relation to America. Not without great interest is the intimate connection between American history and the resettlement of Jews in England. According to Lucian Wolff, what a name. According to Lucian Wolff, American history really played a very considerable part in bringing about the return of the Jews to England. It was in America that religious liberty won its first victory. A Jewish traveler, Antonio de Montesinos, was fully persuaded that in the American Indians he found the lost 10 tribes, a belief which has had an extraordinary vitality. He related this story to Manasseh ben Israel, and his narrative made a profound impression. This fact accorded with the view of the times, that the dispensation was complete except for one particular land, England, and Manasseh argued that if the Jews would return to England, the Messiah would come. Fascinating. This view he promulgated in his work, The Hope of Israel. The notion that the American Aborigines were the lost 10 tribes has played an important part among Americanists. Besides those named above, it was held by Roldan, Garcia, Thorogood, Adair, and Lord Kingsborough, and though without important adherence among students of the American Aborigines, it is still discussed as a theory to be considered. It seems not unlikely that some of the members of the crypto-Jewish community in London prior to the Restoration came from the American continent, the United States. The greatest prosperity and the largest population reached by any nation on the American continent have been attained by the United States. It is not surprising, therefore, that it now contains a larger number of Jews than any country in the world, save Russia and Austria. Austria, okay, we're talking 1912, Austria has in it more Jews than any place in the world next to Russia. Interesting. About 40 years after the settlement of New Amsterdam, Jews commenced to arrive there. Well, I'm like bad at reading, aren't I? About 40 years after the settlement of New Amsterdam, Jews commenced to arrive there. They gradually made their way to all of the original 13 colonies. And by the time of the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, they had in several communities reached honorable positions in commerce and in society. Most of the early colonists in North America were of Sephardic stock and came from Brazil, West Indies, Portugal, and Holland. At a later date, some came from England. Yet German and Polish Jews came to America much earlier than is usually supposed. Some of these settled in Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina in the earliest colonial period. Sephardim, the Sephardim, however, at this time, constituting the larger number, usually organized the congregations, and the fact of the early immigration of Ashkenazic Jews has thus been lost sight of by most writers. German Jews seem even to have been among the martyrs of the Inquisition in Mexico. New York. By a letter written April 4th, 1652, from Amsterdam, by the director of the West India Company to the governor and council of New Netherlands, it appears that Jews were on the muster rolls of soldiers and sailors sent out to the colony, and that they engaged to serve for a term of 1 year. As early as 1655, there were both Portuguese and German Jews in the colony. The first Jewish settler in New Amsterdam, whose name has been handed down, was Jacob Bar Simpson. Jacob Bar Simpson, who arrived on July 8th, 1654, in the ship Pear Tree. He was followed in the same year by a party of 28 who arrived in the bark Saint Caterina. Saint Caterina? It is generally assumed that they came from Brazil, although it is also held that they started from some port in the West Indies, most likely Cuba, and some had unquestionably spent a longer or shorter time in Jamaica. They were received in an unfriendly fashion by Stuyvesant, the Dutch. The Dutch what? Governor of New Amsterdam. Ooh, let me take a sip of my drink. Who wrote to the directors of the Dutch West India Company asking authority for their exclusion. This the directors refused to grant, April 26, 1655, on the ground that the considerable loss sustained by the Jews in the taking of Brazil, and also because of the large amount of capital which they have invested in the shares of the company. Let me read that again. The directors refused the grant on the grounds that the considerable loss sustained by the Jews in the taking of Brazil, and also because of the large amount of capital which they have invested in the shares of the company. They directed that they shall have permission to sail to and trade in New Netherlands and to live and remain there. This permission was modified on March 13th, 1656, by the statement that the Jews were not privileged to erect a synagogue, and a little later they were precluded from employment in any public service and from opening retail shops. One of the sturdiest pioneers of the New Amsterdam colony was Asher Levy. How unsteady I am. Holy smokes. Give me a second. Where are we at, Asher Levy? In 1955, he, among others, applied to be enlisted in the militia, but permission was refused and in common with all other Jews, he was instead ordered to pay a tax. This he refused to do. And on November 5th, 1655, he petitioned for leave to stand guard like other burghers of New Amsterdam. The petition was rejected, but Levy seems to have appealed to Holland, for it subsequently appears that he was permitted to do a guard duty like other citizens. Step by step, let's see. Yes, Fast Ed. I'm feeling like not good about right now. We're so unsteady. Steady. Ba-ba. The petition was rejected, but Levy seems to have appealed to Holland, for it subsequently appears that he was permitted to do guard duty like other citizens. Step by step, through the courts and by appeals, he secured many other privileges. He seems to have been the first Jew in the state of New York to hold real estate. A lot on what is now the site of Albany was owned by him in 1661. Another of the most prominent of the early Jews in New Amsterdam was Abraham de Lucena. And for those of you who don't know, New Amsterdam is now called New York. Let's see, Abraham de Lucena, who in 1655 applied with several others for permission to purchase a site for a burial ground. The request was refused with the statement that there was then no need of it. On July 14th, 1656, however, the request was granted. New Amsterdam was captured by the British in 1664 and its name changed to New York. For a half century afterward, but little is the punctuation in this book is so atrocious. Okay. For a half century afterward, but little is known respecting the Jewish residents. That's not a sentence. Their increase in numbers was very moderate. It seems likely that they had some sort of private worship very soon after 1655, and that they began to meet in a more or less public way in 1673. In 1682, the congregation rented a house on Mill Street, and it was not until 1729 that this was exchanged for a regular synagogue building. On November 15th, 1727, an act was passed by the General Assembly of New York providing that when the oath of abjuration was to be taken by any one of His British Majesty's subjects professing the Jewish religion, the words, "upon the true faith of a Christian," might be omitted. 3 days later, an act was passed naturalizing one Daniel Nunez de Costa. There was a very considerable antipathy in the colony both to Catholics and to Jews. Well, you don't say, they're one and the same. But in the case of the latter, this gradually relaxed, so that they soon came to receive most of the privileges accorded to other inhabitants of the town and province. In 1737, however, the Assembly of New York decided that no Jew might vote for a member of that body. Before and during the Revolutionary War, the Jews, like other inhabitants of New York, were divided in their allegiance. Many were devoted to the Patriot cause, and among these was the minister of the congregation, Gershom Mendez Sycas, who, upon the occupation of New York by the British, took all the belongings of the synagogue and appears to have comprised about 200 families. The community was dispersed by the war, and it never regained its importance. In 1790, it presented an address to Washington. The Toro family bequeathed sufficient money to maintain the synagogue as well as the cemetery. And these are still in existence, although the number of Jews now resident in Newport is but small. The Jewish community of Newport held an especially interesting and even a unique position in America, and impressed itself for all time on the town, once the leading port of the colonies and now the most fashionable summer resort in the United States. It imposed itself there for all time. Other parts of New England. An occasional Jew may have strayed into other portions of New England in the early days, but the Puritan atmosphere was apparently not congenial. The best known of the early settlers was Judah Monas, who became a convert to Christianity and filled the chair of Hebrew in Harvard College from 1722 until his death in 1764. As early as 1670, there is mention of a Jew, Jacob Lucene, in the colonial records of Connecticut. When the British took Newport, many of the Jews there left and effaced a temporary settlement at Leicester, Massachusetts. But this did not survive the close of the war. A number of Jews included the Hayes family, settled at Boston before 1800. About 1840, Jews began to see they don't this. How about a comma once in a while? About 1840, Jews began to immigrate from New York to New Haven and Boston, and congregations were formed in those cities in 1840 and 1842, respectively. I beg your pardon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me holler at my children real quick. Sons! Sons! Y'all be quiet. Tisk, tisk. Yeah, I had to holler at him, you hear me? The communal life of the New England Jews was without especial incident, and their numbers increased but slowly until after the beginning of the Great Russian Immigration of 1882. Interesting. Immediately, the overflow from New York, as well as the immigration through Canada, commenced to pour into New England. It is estimated that 60,000 Jews now, in 1901, reside in Massachusetts alone, and nearly 20,000 more in other New England states. An interesting phenomenon has been noticed in connection with the shifting of agricultural industry in the United States. With the opening up of the Western country and the greater advantages offered by the virgin soil. Let me highlight that. The Great Russian Immigration of 1882. Did y'all know about that? That's something for us to talk about another time. An interesting phenomenon has been noticed in connection with the shifting of agricultural industry. Hold on. Hey, sons. If you will not stay at the back of the house, would you please go outside? Daddy's reading to people live. Please go ahead. Son, please go ahead, okay? Thank you. What good boys. An interesting phenomenon, I'm not reading that for the third time. With the opening up of the Western country and the greater advantages offered by the virgin soil, many New England farmers absolutely abandoned their comparatively unfruitful farms and moved west. These abandoned farms, especially in Connecticut, have been taken up by Russian Jews. Oh, what a coincidence. Who principally, as dairy farmers, have added a new and useful element to the agricultural community. Maryland. It seems not unlikely that Maryland was the first colony in which Jews settled, though they were probably stragglers, and it is long before any communal life was established. Scattered Jews seem to have arrived shortly after the establishment of the provincial government in 1634. Okay, I apologize. I'm going to step away for a moment. I'm coming. Oy vey. These kids. Yeah. That's why I don't like to read live, but this is a long article, and I don't have space on my phone to record this. All right, let's see. Maryland. All right, thanks for staying with me. Now, this is exhausting. I've been reading for an hour, and I'm sweating. That's ridiculous. It seems not unlikely that Maryland was the first colony in which Jews settled, though they were probably stragglers, and it was long before any communal life was established. Scattered Jews seem to have arrived shortly after the establishment of the provincial government in 1634. At least as early as 1657, Dr. Jacob Lombroso was settled there, and in 1658 he was tried and remanded for blasphemy, his release being due to the general amnesty in honor of the accession of Richard Cromwell, declared March 3rd, 1658. Letters of denization were issued to him September 10th, 1663. He had a plantation and also practiced medicine. That's called a sorcerer. He is described as from Lisbon, but he had a sister in Holland. The history of the Jews in Maryland is of a special interest, since it was in this colony and state that the civil and political rights of Jews were most restricted, and it was here, of all America, that the most systematic efforts were put forth for obtaining the fullest recognition under the law. Maryland was one of the first colonies to adopt religious toleration as the basis of the state. But it was toleration and not liberty, since there was a proviso that any person who denied the Trinity was to be punished with death. What? What? Let's read that again. So we're over here in Maryland. It was toleration and liberty, since there was a proviso that any person who denied the Trinity was to be punished with death. Even after the Revolution, no one might hold any office or of profit or trust under the state without signing a declaration that he believed in the Christian religion. That's far out. Efforts were made in 1801 and 1804 to obtain a revocation of this proviso. But on both occasions, more than 2/3 of the legislature voted against its repeal. These efforts were renewed in 1819 and finally succeeded, so that in 1824, 2 Jewish citizens were elected members of the Council of Baltimore, being the first Jews to hold office in the state of Maryland. The success of these efforts was largely due to the persistent labors of a single family, the Cohens, who still maintain an honored position in the community. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Maryland, although remaining in the Union, numbered among her citizens a large body of sympathizers with the Confederate cause. The conflict of opinion was especially severe among the Jews due to the pronounced anti-slavery attitude assumed by Rabbi David Einhorn, who was actually threatened with violence and was obliged to leave the city. We learned about Rabbi David Einhorn in my book about Jews during the Civil War, of which there are 2 videos on this channel. Oh, hey, y'all check this out. Look, my nail fell off, and it's growing back. Gross, huh? Pennsylvania. Jews from New Amsterdam traded along South River, subsequently named the Delaware, as early as 1655, and began to arrive as settlers in the colony of Pennsylvania not much more than 10 years after its establishment. Unlike New York and Newport, a very considerable proportion of the early Pennsylvania colonists were not Portuguese, but German Jews. Let's read that again. A considerable proportion of the early Pennsylvania colonists were German Jews, and they settled not in Philadelphia, but in towns in the interior of the state. The earliest settlements seem to have been in Schaefersville in Lancaster. Joseph Simon, who in the latter place was the pioneer, about 1740 embarked in the Indian trade and in real estate transactions on a large scale. In 1747, the deed for a Jewish cemetery in Lancaster was made out in his name and in that of Isaac Nunez Ricas as trustees. Meyerhart was one of the founders of Easton in 1750. He was engaged in trade and was there naturalized on October 3rd, 1764. Aaron Levy settled in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, about 1760 and was a large landowner. In 1786, he founded the town of Aaronsburg in Centre County. The Jewish community of Philadelphia was, for a time, the leading one in the United States and was inferior in numbers only to that of New York. A fun fact is that this same place is now the center of white nationalism in 2025 in America. In 1786, he founded the town. Okay, I already did that. The first Jewish settler in Philadelphia of whom there is recorded was Jonas Aaron, and the second was Arnold Bamberger. As early as 1747, a number of persons who had joined together for a purpose of worship met for services in a small house in Sterling Alley, afterward in Cherry Alley, between 3rd and 4th Streets. They were mostly German and Polish Jews, and their differences as to the liturgy to be followed prevented at the time the formation of any regular congregation. When the British troops occupied New York during the Revolutionary War, the minister, Gershom Mendez Segsa, with a considerable portion of the New York congregation, came to Philadelphia, and finding no regular services, they, with the help of the resident Jews, established one in accordance with the Portuguese rite. Secas was the first minister. After him, no man of importance held the position until Isaac Leeser in 1829. He was the leading. Oh boy. I think we're a little more than halfway done. He was the leading Jewish minister of his time, and not more than two or three others have left such an impress upon American Jewish affairs as he. Minister, teacher, organizer, translator of the Bible, editor, and publisher, he was in every way indefatigable. Other prominent persons were the Phillips family, chief among them being Zaligman Phillips, Henry M. Phillips, the latter one of the leading lawyers of Philadelphia and a member of the 35th Congress. There followed Leeser, a minister of the Mikveh Israel congregation, Sabato Morias, a native of Leghorn, Italy, who from 1851 until his death in 1897 was a leading figure in American Jewish affairs. He first suggested the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Did I read that right? Yeah. The first German congregation was the Rodef Shalom, which received a charter on August 12, 1802, but which no doubt had meetings at an earlier date. The most prominent of its rabbis was Marcus Jastrow, the best-known cantor, Jacob Frankel. The latter acted during the Civil War as chaplain of hospitals under the United States government. The first leading Reform minister installed in Philadelphia was Rabbi Samuel Hirsch. Many other congregations have since been formed, more especially since 1882, when the Russian immigration brought large numbers to the city. Philadelphia has always been prominent in educational matters. The first Jewish Sunday school was organized there in 1838. The Hebrew Education Society in 1848, and the Maimonides College in 1867. The largest fund in the United States for higher Jewish education is that provided by a deed of gift from Hyman Gratz to the Mikveh Israel Congregation and Trust, from which Gratz College is supported. One of the most comprehensive of works relating to Jews of any single community in the United States is The Jews of Philadelphia by Henry Samuel Morias, published in Philadelphia in 1894. Philadelphia Jews have been prominent in many professions and in the fine arts and in all the avenues of manufacture and commerce. Up to 1894, as many as 116 had been admitted to the bar, and the number has since been greatly increased. 3 Jews served in Congress as representatives of the state. Jews gradually made their way to the western parts of the state, settling in large numbers in Pittsburgh, which, after Philadelphia, is the next largest community in Pennsylvania. Oh, I beg your pardon. As far as I know, it's Pittsburgh, which is the center of white nationalism in America in 2025. Since the Russian immigration, Jews have made their way to every part of the state, and there is scarcely a town of any size which is now without its community or congregation. Okay. That's all I'm going to read for now. We're going on past an hour. Let's see, we're on page 496. And we've got maybe 9 pages left to go. Let's take a look at the chat. J Diggs 102, message redacted. Boy, not now. Yo, hey Fast Ed. Chrisonisur, Ren Frogney, TND, Folk Doom 3, that's right. Julian, your bandwidth is maxing out because you're streaming twice over. I don't know what you mean by that. Despite the challenges, they always exaggerate any suffering. This is Fast Ed. They long so badly to be seen as heroic. Let's see. Oliver Twisted. So did your first channel get nuked? It took me forever to find you again. I deleted my first channel. My channel maxed out in size and in engagement in the second month, so that's in March, and it had been shadow banned. It was, hey dude, no, chill out. It was totally stagnant. My channel stagnated for a month, and what was I saying? Puppy, cut it out. Oh, and I had two community strikes, two YouTube strikes, but that's not even like exactly why. I mean, these obviously it didn't make sense to sink much more effort into a channel that was nobody could find it. The only people who knew about it were the people who had found it a month prior. So I deleted it because it made sense. Oliver Twisted, please set up a Rumble account and post all your vids there for backup, Julian. I have a Rumble account. I have vids there. I hate Rumble. I hate it. It's like it's all it cares about is money. Although there is a friend of the channel who has a video streaming website, and I'm going to. He said he was mirroring all my videos. We'll see. If he doesn't, maybe I will. And maybe I'll start posting there. I don't know. I'll make a post about that. Thank you, Oliver Twisted. Why does it keep skipping? Oy vey. Is there some way to feed this to an AI and then ask it questions? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, you know what's cool is that you could actually upload an audio file to ChatGPT and it'll just scan it, and pretty cool. DL, Holla, yeah. Great Russian Migration of 1882. We're going to leave out there. Go learn about the Great Russian Migration of 1882, my friends. And we're going to have part 2 of the America article in the Jewish Encyclopedia coming soon. Go to at FOLKDOOM number 3. That's a channel I made today, and it's going to exclusively be it's Jewish Encyclopedia videos. The only reason I'm doing this video here is so that I could live stream it, and I'm going to download this and upload it there. If y'all are into this kind of content, go check it out over there. Folk Doom. Doom means judgment. It's Old English. Folk Doom is judgment by the people. Hey, Rafi, you're catching me just as I go. I have a new channel at Folk Doom, FOLKDOOM 3. Folk Doom means judgment by the people in God's name. Folk Doom is Jesus Christ, the people convening to judge righteous judgment. So, yeah, I know this was kind of impromptu, Rafi, but look, I'm going to be live tomorrow evening and Tuesday evening. So, and then I'll actually be able to engage with y'all, because today I was just reading. But, yeah, God bless you, brothers and sisters. Talk to you later. Bye.